You'll notice, of course, that within policing terms, we're sliding down the rank scale here. We've started with an assistant chief constable, we've moved on to a superintendent, and now I'm afraid we're really in the weeds of policing with just an inspector. So my apologies in advance for being down in the real operational stuff and hands-on. So apologies in advance. I guess to set this into some context, I asked the question, should I be confident in policing? Is the work that I do on a daily basis something that I'm confident in? And that's perhaps a very different perspective from a lot that we've heard already about whether the public should be confident in us. And I'm sure they're connected points, but really the purpose of this is to just explore with you some of the work I've done recently as part with the business school here, just into a very specific area of policing, which is called threats to life. So before we go any further, if I come out with any jargon or I use an expression which is perhaps not familiar, just please shout and I'll reference it for the recording. So if I use TTL, that's short for threats to life, and so on and so forth. But some time back, I've been involved in a number of areas within policing, and probably about 3 years ago started to ask the question, not what are we doing in policing, but why? I was part of a process that had a budget of probably £3.5 million, and we would give this out to policing problems, and people would come to us and say we have an issue with something. And typically it would go like this: we've got a big burglary problem over here, can we have some dogs please to come and patrol that area? And it sounded great, and we'd say yes, and we'd send the dogs over there, and that would be that, and the problem would stop and the dogs would be given a medal. But I started to ask the question actually after a while, it's got a bit repetitive, to say what is our efficacy around the deployment of resources to particular problems, and do we understand it? For example, how many times did the dog actually get out the car, other than for a walk or a wee or something like that? Did it have any material effect whatsoever? Because we're spending an inordinate amount of money, time, resource and effort on particular tactics here, and that was the start of something really which translated into my role as a divisional DI in Salford, where in 2014 we had a shooting, and it was the first one I'd picked up since I landed in Salford. So I won't go into the details of it, but at the start we didn't know whether people had been shot, whether they were killed, whether they were still alive. We didn't know whether two groups had shot at each other or whether it was just one group shooting at another. It was all the chaos of some very early critical incident management. And this was Salford, where in the Brass Handles pub, two people went in 5 years or so ago and shot at people quite deliberately, and then were taken out and executed outside by the people inside who had the guns. So it isn't quite the Wild West, but it's not that far away from it at times. And I devised a series of strategies and policies and made a load of early decisions around this shooting, which involved one of the most fundamental inquiries in policing, which is house-to-house sort of witness trawling, to go and knock on every door and see if anyone had seen or heard anything that was relevant. The next day, a more senior detective came in just to critique my work and to make sure I'd not missed anything too obvious, because it was the first one that I dealt with in Salford. And as part of that critique, started to ask me about why I'd made certain decisions around these parameters for these houses that we'd gone to. Why had we only gone so far? And in the police, we love round numbers, so tend to do 10 houses in one direction, not 13. If you say an odd number or a funny number, people think you really know what you're on about. So I tend to go with 18 or 21. Because people just assume all sorts. So I started to fire back at him and say, look, you know, you work on these incidents all the time, you have access to a database called Homes, which we put all of this information on. This happened at 3 o'clock on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, just as the schools were emptying. What difference should that make to my considerations here? And there was a bit of a silence, and I said, okay, the offenders were in a vehicle, so their route and access and egress were in a white van. How should that affect it? Sort of more silence, and I said, okay, so this was loud, there were probably about 8 gunshots. Again, how should that affect what I'm doing? Because all of these variables in a situation we surely know something about here. I've only gone to the end of the street, because after that it's a main road, and I'm not so sure people are going to notice a white van on a road where hundreds go past. And the short answer to that was there were no answers to these questions, and my rationale and my structure, which as an SIO I'm drilled into to have some detail around, there was no knowledge about, there was no depth to. And that started to eat into probably most aspects of what I did, and then came to study here at Warwick Business School and did a module on epistemology, and started to touch on definitions around knowledge and started to look at that. So Plato's explanation, which is that true judgment tied down by working out of the explanation, is knowledge. Ayer's definition, which was that knowledge must feel secure and be entitled to feel secure to count as knowledge, started to resonate. And the worrying part for me was the more fundamentally I looked at the basics of policing, the more I found a lot of well-articulated practice that in no way could be justified. We didn't know what difference dogs made to burglary problems, just as little as the senior SIO didn't really know why I should or shouldn't be going any further with particular inquiries. And so on the back of that, I started a research piece in my dissertation to look at whether evidence-based policing or other forms of research would be a better way forward. And as I've said, threats to life was the area that I picked to look into. And the early sort of thought that came to mind was around Keith Grint's work on tame, wicked and critical problems. Because there was something that stuck around if the type of the problem that we're looking at is different, if it's how do we stop drugs being sold illegally in Salford, that's a particularly different problem to how do I respond to a shooting or how do I deal with a management question. And so the whole tame, wicked and critical aspects of different problems prompted the thought about, well, should that influence the research methods that we're taking to understand these problems? So the question which I posed was, what are the foundations of knowledge in threats to life in Salford at the moment? And we do give them out like confetti, so there's quite a lot in existence in Salford. And then sort of following on from that, what is the way forward to better understand that business? Now for threats to life, I won't explore that extensively, but effectively threats to life are a national piece of legislation which came out of two particular cases, Osman and Van Col. And in both cases, the police were in possession of information or intelligence that their life was at risk or could reasonably be expected to be at risk, and that the police ought to have known of this and done something about it. And we either didn't or didn't do that effectively and breached Article 2 of the Human Rights. So again, without going too much into what threats to life are as a national process, they can be broken down into various stages. Generally, we will receive some information that Ben Hart or whoever, a specific person, is at risk. And that risk is either going to be fatal, it's going to be very serious, or it might involve sexual violence or sexual harm. And if it hits any of those criteria, then we meet a definition statutorily that this should be documented as a threat to life. From there, we will generally research and develop that. We will start to look at what else we know, what else is in the police systems. We'll risk assess it. We will score it against standard UK risk assessment terminology, which is impact versus likelihood. We'll then look at some interventions and what we might be able to do to either reduce, mitigate, or completely eliminate the risks that are present within it. We'll then monitor that, and generally at a given point in time, we will close it when we think the risk has de-escalated down to being low. The people who make these decisions are explicitly detective inspectors and above. So as part of the national standards, it's me and it's my colleagues in Salford who do the same role, who are responsible for making these assessments. They are peer-reviewed and ratified by detective chief inspectors and detective superintendents. And my research into this was specifically looking at a small cohort of people which were all the key decision makers in Salford. So that was a group of 10 people of those three ranks. In terms of the research, one of the things I looked at to start with was quite basically, what is the level of teaching that you've been given? What is it that you've been given in terms of understanding, training, to be in these key roles, to understand the context that you're in and the decisions that you're making? And without going into all of it, the answers varied between none to, well, 7 years ago I had a 15-minute presentation on it, to, well, I get an odd email which tells me how to apply some of this. And organisationally, a huge vulnerability came up straight away that actually there is no structured learning, there is no structured teaching to people in key decision-making roles. They will do national training, which I've done around the DIDP, which is the Detective Inspector's Portfolio. They may have done SIO training, but there is no focus specifically on threats to life or the key decision-making roles and how they vary and how they should be different within this process. Interestingly, when I tried to compare that to academic levels of attainment and say, look, you practice at the moment in terms of that input, how does that compare to, for example, a GCSE, in terms of the testing, the level of difficulty? The general feeling was that A, there is no testing, so we don't know, this is just an input, and there is no structure whatsoever behind this being continually developed and ensured that you're at that consistent level and you haven't dropped. Then I looked at thematic knowledge. So in very basic terms, if every threats to life which is issued results in a dead body, that is quite a different context to if every threats to life we issue results in no harm whatsoever, and actually, do you know what, nothing ever comes of them. There is quite a different frame of reference here as to where the actual risk might be. Now, the actual answers to these questions, when I probed this in some detail, weren't particularly important. What I wanted to know is whether they knew them or they'd looked at them, or had anyone actually collated this. My impression personally of threats to life is some can contain risk, most don't. And actually we hit an academic and a bureaucratic definition which forces us to act in certain ways. But do I think that most actually constitute a real risk to life? Probably not. But I can't quantify that in any way. We then started to look at the risk assessments, and I went through that with them, and what came out overwhelmingly was just how subjective this process was, and that whilst that is my impression of threats to life, and it's certainly my own experience of them, it certainly wasn't everyone else's. People perceive them very differently and for different reasons. But again, when this level of insight was probed to say, so what changes that? What makes you more or less concerned? And this was semi-structured interviews that were conducted. Why would you think if the threat comes from a knife, that might be more or less pertinent than a firearms threat? What factors actually make you more bothered? Is it the capability of the person, or is it the victim's status, or is it the motive? And these were hugely subjective and massively different across all of the people who were interviewed. Similarly, when we looked at, and this goes back to the burglary and dogs tactic, when we looked at the interventions, I had some fairly strong thoughts on this myself, so I had to be careful to disentangle this from the research. But we have a tick box approach to tactics where there is absolutely no semblance of understanding as to why we're doing what we're doing. So we would instigate a patrol plan on the basis of this, which is cops drive past all the relevant addresses once every half an hour. And it takes an inordinate amount of time and resource to do that. And we all feel nice and warm inside that we're stopping people actually being there. But in reality, that amounts to a 30-second, if that, visibility on a particular street in a 2-hour period, with no evidence base to suggest it makes any difference whatsoever. We do fire risk assessments at all TTL incidents where there's no evidence base to say there's even a threat from arson. But yet local practice is it's a box we have to tick. We've never tried not ticking it, or saying, actually, do we know what that tactic is? Actually, what it involves is one screw going in the back of a letterbox, because I've been there while they've done it, and a lecture to the homeowner about not answering the door. Do we genuinely think that that actually makes any difference to our interventions in these situations? And what came out was no. There is very little confidence in them, and people just don't understand dosage. They don't understand when it's effective, when it may make it worse, or actually the duration that this needs to go on for. And there's quite an easy parallel here with medicine around going to visit a doctor, and about some of the questions I would hope you would ask your doctor if they just said, well, take paracetamol, that makes everything better. How long for? I don't know. What dosage? What strength? I don't know. Just take one a day. You'll be fine. I think quite quickly we would lack confidence in that doctor. So then we got on to having established broadly that, and by the way, just in conclusion, the evaluation process was just as ad hoc. There was no structured review process afterwards. There was no peer learning. There was no sense of debriefing these incidents afterwards to say, so what was unique about this incident? What was different? What was the same? How do we as a collective of DIs who all make these decisions in different cases, how do we learn from that? What focus is there on some of the thematics which we articulate as being important, like ethics in policing, but yet how do we actually translate that and ask, in what is a very thorny area of policing, it's some of the hardest decisions I make are in this area. Ethically, why are we doing certain things? There's no focus on that whatsoever, organisationally, individually, or as a collective locally in Salford. Certainly. So, in conclusion, and I have skirted around a lot of this, the question asked is, so how confident am I in policing? And why would I be confident in it if I was going to be? And I think the idea of knowledge, going back to the earlier slide with Plato, knowledge and confidence are very interrelated, certainly within policing, that if I'm equipped with the appropriate knowledge, I would be far more confident in the decisions I was making, which links to trust, which is probably another component we've talked about quite a lot in a day, which to my mind around confidence is about making the right decisions for the right reasons. Just in conclusion, and this really is the final point here, what sprung to mind when I was talking about this was actually Harold Shipman, on the subject of doctors and confidence. Probably an excellent doctor, someone who had all the prerequisite knowledge to practice medicine, hadn't failed exams, had done very well, was very well liked, but trust-wise didn't make the right decisions, clearly made some pretty awful ones. And conversely, I wonder whether policing, certainly around threats to life, is in the opposite situation. I think we make the right decisions for the right reasons, we just don't have the prerequisite knowledge to understand what effect they have. So thank you very much. I think I've just gone over. That was there or thereabouts. Thank you for your time.
Really, this is addressed to Ben, but anybody can pitch in. And that is, you drew attention to, whether things, were you doing them for a purpose? And it just seems to me there are a lot of things that the police do which they do because it's good in themselves. It may or may not be the case that family liaison officers are able to get more information out of families about the offenders or something of that sort. But to be showing that you care, to be showing you're around, things of that nature. I mean, after all, the evidence on the utility of patrol work is pretty damning. But people value it enormously. Well, why? Because they think that it's right and proper that there must be police around. So I think that, sometimes the question might be not just what brings home the bacon, but what is seen to be good, symbolically.
So I think to address that within threats to life, typically a lot of that intelligence is highly sensitive. It'll come from sources that can never be disclosed, so it's invisible to the broader public, who I doubt, because we never communicate or rarely publicly communicate any of this. I doubt that the general public would understand, if they even saw it, why we were doing particular things around patrol planning or giving certain attention to certain addresses. And a lot of the methodology would be covert anyway around some of the responses. And I think absolutely, I wouldn't disagree with anything that you've said, but I think there's still a question of, in what can be very complex cases, do we understand what effect this may have? Because sometimes not knowing that means other decisions which are premised upon it become just stabs in the dark, is my impression. And I think absolutely, adding value in the FLO role about allocating someone in is absolutely invaluable. And I think you can demonstrate that by a personal interface with a bereaved family and the value that that provides. And I would say tangibly you can see that, witness it and understand it. But at a time of diminishing resources, where in Salford last night there was me, one detective sergeant and one DC, and when one incident came in at 8 o'clock last night, that was it. There is nobody else. I think that there is a responsibility on us to understand our business to a degree that makes us more efficient. And if we don't, and we don't try to do that, we're going to be sending dogs to burglary hotspots when it might not make a blind bit of difference. But it might. I don't know.
I did have the benefit of supervising Ben, so you can blame me for a lot of that. A couple of points I wanted to make was going to the threats to life issue. There's a number of areas of policing which, of course, are causing significant resource burdens, and where I think the practitioners are saying this doesn't really make sense to us, but it's the policy impact. And I think coming back to Tank's point, really, sometimes there's things that you do that you maybe can't put your finger on, but it has some value, and there may be that with threats to life, that visits and reassurance, it's difficult to measure, but maybe that's a side benefit of it, or maybe that's the purpose of it. But clearly, in terms of the amount of effort that goes into and how effective is it at preventing further harm to life, I think that's questionable, and the evidence there to support that policy would be quite weak. It's probably there because of the two stated cases that you mentioned, and you'd get into trouble if you didn't do it. So it becomes a very expensive and questionably unjustified way of responding to a couple of incidents a long time ago that might not be representative. And there's a lot of that in policing. And I think one benefit of the evidence-based approach is that we can now challenge some of those practices. Getting that through is another matter. The point I wanted to bring back about confidence was, I think the first bit, and speaking to the speakers before, talking about the speakers before lunch, confidence was multifaceted, variable, really complex, difficult, moving creature. And I think to some extent the presentations after lunch, we've actually then tried to define it. And I liked your comment at the start about trying to get the measures. Do we measure, is confidence important because we measure it, or is it because we measure it that it's important? But in effect, you define confidence as, we said we did, and it's about crime and antisocial behaviour. And then you define confidence through all your multiple tables and questionnaires. So in effect, we've come up with a definition. You've both come up with definitions of confidence. But is that confidence? And are we then stuck into trying to find measures for things that maybe they're not measured? So maybe it comes back to your narrative question again. So it's whether it's a question or not, I don't know. But it feels as if we're forcing ourselves into try and find measures for things that can't be measured.
So the other point, just maybe to follow up from a slightly different angle, would be to say, when I mentioned Keith Grint's Tame, Wicked and Critical Problems, my confidence in policing is very high in emergency. I think give us a critical incident, give us something which is going to need people to put themselves in harm's way for you. I think I'm absolutely supremely confident that certainly the staff I manage and where I am in Manchester, in no uncertain terms, you've got a group of people that will put themselves in harm's way for you. So in some areas of business, I think quite rightly confidence should be very high. I think it's those different areas and different types of problems where perhaps it isn't a yes or no answer. It's such a complex question. A bit like asking, are you confident in the NHS? So sometimes the question is perhaps the way it's framed more important than the answers we try and get to.
Okay, sorry. I'm Mike Leonard. I'm serving Special Constable in the West Midlands. I just wanted to drill into some of the confidence issues a little bit harder and say, are we really addressing the people who haven't got confidence in reporting crime? Don't report crime. A lot of middle class crime not reported at all as well. Are we looking at the new emerging forms of crime in terms of our surveys and thinking about the stuff that happens, not traditional crime, which we've looked at a lot so far. So more of the electronic crime that's going on. How are we measuring people's confidence against those sort of things? So that's the first thing. And the second question really is how much do we take into account and properly give the opportunity for our workforce to give their feedback on whether they think what they're doing is the right thing and the good thing, in a non-confrontational way, so they can get honest answers. But I think that we probably don't do enough to get the valued feedback from our colleagues.
I guess on the second point there, that's probably certainly within Manchester, an individual thing. That do I sit down with the staff and actually ask them for their honest opinions? And I know what my teams think, certainly of half the things that we do around our investigations, because I ask them and say, listen, should we go and do another fire risk assessment? Put a screw in the door. And we're all fairly realistic about pragmatically what that involves. I think systemically as an organisation or even nationally, I'm not so sure I could comment with any confidence. I'd suspect not. But then equally, I don't see it massive blocks to that. So if someone came through and said, I think that's a load of rubbish, I don't think there's any huge prohibitors for that.